Hey everyone, this is Ram from Fourth Ventricle, and today we'll be talking about the arterial supply of the brain and the circle of Willis. Now, this is a particularly high yield topic, so let's get straight into it. So, first of all, I'd like to begin by talking about the vertebral artery. The vertebral arteries, they arise from the subclavian arteries and they travel through the transverse processes of the cervical vertebrae in the posterior aspect of the neck. They enter the cranium through the foramen magnum, and they give off two main branches. So the first branch that we'll talk about is called the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, also known as PICA. So PICA is the first branch, and this is a paired branch coming from the vertebral artery. And it's not shown in this diagram, but they also give rise to the posterior spinal arteries. Now, the next branch from the vertebral arteries is the anterior spinal artery shown here. So it arises from both the left and right vertebral arteries and they fuse to form the anterior spinal artery shown here. Now, both the right and left vertebral arteries, they both fuse to form the basilar artery. This longitudinal artery you see here, this big one, is called the basilar artery. So the basilar artery also has some very important branches. The first branch that I'll talk about is the anterior inferior cerebellar artery, also known as ICA. Now, after ICA, the next branch is the labyrinthine arteries, shown over here. You also have four paired arteries, which are the pontine arteries, shown over here. Moving on from the pontine arteries, the basilar artery also gives rise to the superior cerebellar arteries on both sides, right and left, and it continues on as the posterior cerebral artery, right and left. Now, the very significant thing about the posterior cerebral artery is that it has a branch on both sides, which is called the posterior communicating artery. Now, this is very significant because this forms the posterior part of the circle of Willis, as you can see here, and it connects the posterior cerebral artery with the internal carotid artery. The internal carotid artery is seen here on both sides, and it has two branches, which is the anterior choroidal artery and the ophthalmic artery. It also has another branch, which is the third branch. It's the anterior cerebral artery, which forms the anterior part of the circle of Willis, and you can see it here on both sides. So the internal carotid arteries, they arise from the bifurcation of the common carotid artery at the level of C4, and it enters the brain through the carotid canal in the temporal bone. And it continues as the middle cerebral artery. So the most significant branch of the internal carotid artery, as I said before, is the anterior cerebral artery, which forms the anterior part of the circle of Willis, and both anterior cerebral arteries are connected together by an anterior communicating artery. So now I'd like to talk about what is the significance of the circle of Willis and about the cerebral blood supply and which arteries supply which portions of the cerebrum. So first of all, we've seen here in the circle of Willis that there are three cerebral arteries. So you have the anterior cerebral artery, the middle cerebral artery, and also the posterior cerebral artery. So the anterior cerebral artery, it supplies the anteromedial part of the cerebrum. The middle cerebral artery supplies the lateral part of the cerebrum, and the posterior cerebral artery supplies the entire posterior part of the cerebrum. Active recall is very important to understand and store information in your long-term memory. So here are some questions that I would like you to answer. What are the branches of the vertebral artery? What are the three cerebral arteries and which part of the cerebrum do they supply? The posterior communicating artery connects which two vessels? The anterior communicating artery connects which two vessels? From where does the internal carotid artery arise? You can pause the video here and attempt to answer these questions. Please feel free to watch the video again to really cement this in your memory. I hope you liked the video. Thank you.